Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Today I'm going to cover Andromache by Euripides. This is from book 35 for my 2024 reading list, and Euripides is selection 15 for my great books reading list. Well, Andromache shows up in another play by Euripides. It's called The Trojan Women, and I covered that a few weeks ago. I'll link to that in the show notes if you're interested. But I highlighted that in that one just how devastating and awful the life of Andromache was. Achilles, famous Achilles, killed her father and 7 brothers. Her mother died at that point as well. And then Andromache goes on to marry Hector, the Prince of Troy, whose father is Priam. And Hector is killed by Achilles as well. So not only has Achilles killed her father and brothers, he has now also killed Andromache's husband, Hector, Prince Hector. She is then forced to marry the son of Achilles. So the man who murdered her whole family, she is forced to marry his son, who's named Neoptolemus. And Andromache also has a son with Hector. He's thrown off the walls and he is killed at the end of the war. That's done by the Greeks. So at the end of the Trojan War, she has lost everything and then is forced to marry the son of her husband's murderer. Just an awful situation, but it just kind of gives insight into post-war, what does life look like for everybody? Some people go back to where they came from. Other people are taken as slaves. What does it look like for the life of a slave, and especially for a female slave in this case? So the situation is just terrible. She's marrying the son of her husband's murderer, and then the two of them have a child together, and it's a boy, and that's all we know is that's what the boy is called in this tragedy play. It's just simply the boy. We're not given a name. So now she has a son with this Greek man, and she is now living in Greece. And so I like to highlight 3 things or note 3 things every time I start a tragedy play, and those are who is the chorus, who is the first speaker, and where is this located. So to start off with the chorus is of the women of Phthia in Thessaly. And so Thessaly is where this takes place. This is well north of Athens, but just as part of Greece. And so the chorus will remain the same throughout the tragedy play. And they just kind of give they kind of help you step back and just get the bigger picture of what is going on. There, at any given time, there'll be 3 characters or 3 actors out on the stage as well with the chorus. And there can be more characters in the play itself, but in these tragedy plays, there would be 3 out there at a time, and then they could put on different masks and be the different characters, but only 3 people at a time. So the chorus is made up of these women in Thessaly here. The first speaker is Andromache, and so the first speaker always just sets the stage. And so it's interesting to note if the first speaker is one of the Greek gods. Is it a person? Who is it? What's their situation? And so the first person we hear from here is Andromache, and the location is in Thessaly, but it's at this altar of Thetis, and Thetis is the mother of Achilles, and so Andromache is at her altar, and she is there as a suppliant. So we've seen this come up in other the tragedy plays, but when someone is in deep trouble, they can go to an altar and kind of hold on to the altar or be in that temple, and then that gives them a certain level of protection against whatever is trying to harm them. And so that's where we're starting off here. Again, this is at the end. This is after the Trojan War. So the men have been killed. The Trojan men have been killed. The children have been killed or taken into slavery. And then the women have been either given as gifts or awards to the Greek warriors, or they've been sold as slaves. So this is an interesting perspective in that we're following the life of a woman taken from Troy taken to Greece. So she is a slave. So there's two other plays that are in the particular book that I read this one in, of Hecate and then the Trojan women. And those both take place right after the Trojan War. So they're still in the area by Troy. This one is different in that we are now in Greece. We are seeing what it looks like for a woman slave taken from the enemy into this new land. What does that look like? So it's just it's an interesting scope, and it's in peacetime, but these slaves are just living through absolute hell. And so I want to start off by reading. This is a few pages into the tragedy, but this is Andromache, and the notes in this part say that she's singing this part. So you can imagine that just as this tragedy is being performed, I don't know whether you think of it as like an opera where there's kind of some speaking parts, but then there's also parts of singing, or maybe a musical or something like that. So this part is meant to be sung, and I'll spare you that. I won't try to do that. But here is a good intro into this tragedy. It was no marriage, but a curse that Paris brought to Troy on its rocky height, when he led Helen to sleep with him there in his bedroom. It was because of her, O Troy, that Greek warriors sailing swiftly on 1,000 ships caught you and took you with fire and the spear. Took Hector, too, the husband of my wretched self, whom the son of the sea goddess Thetis dragged as he drove his chariot around our walls. I myself was led away from my bedroom to the seashore, casting the hateful garb of slavery over my head. And many tears flowed down my flesh when I was leaving my city in my bedroom and my husband in the dust. I cry out in my wretchedness, why did I have to go on living in this light as Hermione's slave? Because of her oppression, I have come as a suppliant to this statue of the goddess, and casting my arms around it, I melt away in tears like a trickle dripping from the rocks. And I'll stop reading it there, but let me just kind of go back through and This really sets us up to understand where we are in this tragedy play. So she says, it was no marriage but a curse that Paris brought to Troy on its rocky height when he led Helen to sleep with him there in his bedroom. So she's talking about the origins of the Trojan War, and it's that Paris, a Greek, took Helen to Troy, led her to his bedroom. And then then Andromache says, it's because of her, O Troy, that Greek warriors sailing swiftly on 1,000 ships caught you and took you with fire and the spear. So it's because of this that the Greeks came and destroyed Troy. And as part of that, her husband dies, she is taken, and she's led away from her bedroom to the seashore. And so just even an interesting little parallel there, where at the beginning we hear that Helen is brought to the bedroom of Paris, and then just a little bit down, Andromache is led away from her bedroom. So there's this bedroom scene in both of those. And now she has come as a suppliant to the goddess because of Hermione. So who's Hermione? Well, Hermione is also married to Neoptolemus, and Hermione is the daughter of Menelaus and Helen. So Helen of Troy, the famous Helen, this is her daughter Hermione. So not only is Neoptolemus married to Andromache, but she's more of a slave, whereas Hermione is kind of the wife, the Greek wife. And so this is a good place to start, because she is now a suppliant at the altar of Thetis, because Hermione wants to kill her. So there's jealousy, there's some other things going on that I'll get into, but that's where we get started here. One note that's just kind of interesting as I continue to go through this tragedy is all of these parts would have been performed by men, including the chorus. So the chorus is made of women. Many of the characters in this tragedy are women, and so it's just kind of funny to think of it that way. They would have had these masks on that showed who they were, but it's kind of interesting to consider that despite there being so many women in this play, that all those parts would have been played by men. So the last couple episodes I've done something where I just walk through the tragedy play. I don't divide the episode into different segments, but I just walk through the play. I talk about different themes. I read some parts or some quotes that I just thought were incredible, and just try to give kind of an overview of the tragedy play. My hope is that you do end up reading this. These take between 2 and 3 hours to read, and they are just so good. They're so rich and so fantastic. So I do hope you read this one, but just kind of want to give a quick overview of the tragedy play, but then also the things that really stuck out to me. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, Andromache has just led a life of just utter horror. And she says that on one of the first pages, she says, "Has there been or will there ever be a woman as wretched as myself?" So she just starts it off right away and with that question. And from what I've read of Greek literature, I can't think of anyone who has suffered more. There are some that are pretty close, but I think Andromache gets the suffering cake in this one. Neoptolemus is married to this Spartan Hermione, and again, she's the daughter of Menelaus and Helen. And what Hermione does is accuse Andromache of giving her drugs, because Hermione is barren. She is not able to have a child with her husband Neoptolemus, whereas Andromache has had a son with Neoptolemus. So Hermione is the wife, but here's this slave woman in the house, Andromache, and she has the child, but Hermione doesn't. So you can imagine there's jealousy there, and so she accuses Andromache of giving her drugs. And Andromache is from Troy, which is from Asia Minor, and so there's a lot of elements of just the foreigner in this particular tragedy play. So the foreigner is giving her drugs, she thinks, to keep her remaining barren. Well, because of this, Hermione wants to kill Andromache, and she also wants to kill the son of Andromache, because that just is poison in the wound. It's salt in the wound, and it's just eating at her. So she wants to kill these two people. And that's why Andromache is at the altar. She's pleading for her life. Well, Menelaus, her father, Hermione's father, he comes in and he comes for the purpose of killing Andromache and Andromache's son. And all the while, Neoptolemus is away. He's not in the picture for this tragedy until later on, and not in a good way. So the fact that Neoptolemus is gone, it puts you in a similar mindset to the Odyssey, where Odysseus is gone, and there's things that happen at home that would have never happened at home had Odysseus been home, but he's not home, and so that's what sets up the action. And the same thing here, you keep getting these references to Neoptolemus. If he was just there, things would be better, but he's not there, and in his absence, things are moving in a very bad direction. So Menelaus kind of gives an ultimatum to Andromache, and he tells her, if you leave the altar, if you step away from the altar, that will save your son. And she does it. She gets away from the altar, but then he says, okay, I'm going to kill you instead of your son, but I'm going to leave it up to my daughter Hermione to decide if your son should live or not. So he does not honor his promise in a just way. And now both of them are at risk, both Andromache and her son. And again, this is the son of Neoptolemus as well, but Neoptolemus is gone. Now, Peleus comes in and comments that there has been no trial. There's no justice here. This is not right. And again, Peleus is the father of Achilles. And remember, Achilles is the father of Neoptolemus. So Peleus is the grandfather of Neoptolemus. And Peleus is also married to Thetis. And that is whose altar Andromache is at here. Thetis was a goddess and Peleus was a human. So that's where Achilles was a demigod. He was half god, half human. And that's how that came about, where his mother was a goddess, Thetis, and then his father is Peleus. So Peleus comes into the scene here. He kind of sees what's going on. He sees that there's chaos, and he gets to speak directly to Menelaus, which is just an incredible scene to kind of hear what they have to say to each other. And so Peleus blames Menelaus for a lot of the different things. He blames Helen, but then he also blames Menelaus. And so here is Peleus speaking directly to Menelaus. He says this: once you had discovered her to be promiscuous, and the her here is Helen. Once you had discovered her to be promiscuous, far from going to war, you ought to have spat her out and let her stay there, paying Paris to keep her and never taking her back to your house. But the wind of your thought did not blow that way. No, you destroyed many souls of good men. You made old women childless in their houses and robbed gray-haired fathers of their noble sons. I am one of those wretched men. I look upon you as the murderer of Achilles, as a source of pollution. And I'll end the quote there. So Peleus puts the blame on the Trojan War, on all of that, on Menelaus for not letting his wife go, not letting Helen go when she was unfaithful to him by leaving with Paris. So they kind of have a verbal battle for a while, and then Menelaus says that the gods sent the trouble to Helen, which is really interesting because that's what Priam says in the Iliad, that he doesn't blame Helen for the Trojan War. He doesn't blame her for all that's happening. He blames it on the gods, and that's an argument that could be made when you look at the story of the judgment of Paris and the gods' involvement in getting all of this kicked off. But I always like to see which of the characters, who each of the characters blame for the start of the Trojan War, and seeing how that ties into the Iliad as well. Now Hermione at some point becomes afraid because of her stance on wanting to kill Andromache. And she becomes afraid that her husband, Neoptolemus, will kill her because of wanting the death of Andromache and Andromache's son, who is also Neoptolemus's son. And so she starts to get worried. She wants to leave. And at this time, Orestes arrives. And yes, Orestes, who killed his mother, Clytemnestra. And so it's interesting how he arrives right at this time, and he had actually wanted to marry Hermione, and so that's the connection here. But Hermione's father Menelaus had wanted her to marry Neoptolemus instead. And so Orestes now wants to help get Hermione out of this area and get her to Menelaus, her father, so that he can protect her. While he is kind of plotting all this, Orestes is also plotting a way to kill Neoptolemus. He hears that Neoptolemus will be at the Oracle of Delphi, and so he figures out a way to kill Neoptolemus while he is there. It involves other people in Delphi, but they eventually do kill Neoptolemus, and Peleus, his grandfather, finds out and is just absolutely distraught. So I'm going to read that part because, of course, this is a tragedy, and you've got to have some good, just distraught people. So here we go. This is Peleus after finding out that his grandson has been brutally murdered. Oh, what sorrow for me! What a horror I see here, and receive into my house with a touch of my hand. Alas, alas, I cry, O city of Thessaly, all is over for us. We are ruined. I no longer have a family. No children are left in the house. What afflictions I have to endure. To what friend can I turn my eyes and find pleasure? O beloved mouth and cheek and hands, if only fate had slain you beneath Ilium on the banks of Simois. And the quote there, but just devastating. He realizes at this point then his house is ruined. There's no one left. Except there is one person left, and it's Neoptolemus' son with Andromache. And so that goes on to there is a little bit of hope at the very end, but that is how that's what he's saying here, is just that he is ruined. It is all over for us. We are ruined. I no longer have family, no children left in the house. At the few pages later, Thetis comes in, and she comes in a way that is common in these tragedy plays. They call it Deus ex machina. So there would be a crane, a crane that would kind of bring in the god at the end, and this god would kind of save the day, or just make things right, or say something that would kind of end the the play or give it a unique turn. And so what Thetis does in this case is she comes in Deus Ex Machina, and then she saves Peleus. So he is distraught, and they are married, but they've been split. They have not been living together. She's a goddess. She lives in the sea, and he was a human. But at the end here, she comes to save him. She turns him into a god so that he can then dwell with Thetis. And Euripides may have distanced himself from other works of mythology and kind of made this part up where he's turned into a god. But that's how this play ends. So there is a little bit of hope in that. At the very end, there's just a few statements I want to read. This one is from Thetis herself. She says this: "Grieve no longer for the dead. After all, this is what the gods have decreed for all mankind. Death is the debt men have to pay." And then at the very end, the chorus closes out with this. And this is actually a common ending for Euripides. This one shows up in 4 or 5 different of his tragedies. "The divine will manifest itself in many forms, and the gods bring many things to pass against our expectation. What we thought would happen remains unfulfilled, while the god has found a way to accomplish the unexpected. And that is what has happened here." That's the very end of this tragedy play. It's an interesting structure, this particular play, because at the beginning you've got the persecution of Andromache, and this structure is pointed out in the introduction to this particular version of Andromache that I read. But you start out with the persecution of Andromache, and then there is Peleus comes in to rescue her. But then you have this Hermione, kind of at the midway point. Hermione is persecuted. Or at least she fears persecution, and then she has this rescue by Orestes. And it's within this structure that you see the tragic injustice of this whole thing, because there is legitimate, actual persecution going on of Andromache. She is a slave by this point. She is at the mercy of everyone around her. She has lost everything. Everything. And she is rescued by Peleus. Hermione is this kind of manufactured persecution, and it's all been caused by her actions. It's because she has wanted to kill Andromache. It's because of her jealousy. It's because she can't stand the fact that her husband has had a son with another woman, and so her persecution is brought on by herself, and then her rescue is by Orestes, and it's for him to take her away from her husband. And so it's just this twisted sort of parallel where it just heightens this sense of injustice for Andromache. But it is just kind of a neat way to consider the structure of this play and how it was set up like that. I want to cover a few themes in this one, and a big one is justice. And so a little bit in, we get this statement from Andromache, where she says this: "Do you think that the gods are not gods and do not look after justice?" And then she is saying that to Menelaus. And that's something that comes up in quite a few of these tragedy plays. It's just this question of, do you know what you're doing? You're doing something that is not just. And if you're doing this, do you realize one of two things you see in these tragedy plays? One is, do you not realize that, or do you not think that gods are gods, and that they don't look after justice? So there's this appeal to, don't you realize that you can't do this because the gods will not look kindly on this. But then there's also this other idea that if you do this, it will come back on you. So if you decide that you determine the law in this case, be careful, because you will be the first person who gets that law back on them. So the way you do you live by the sword, you die by the sword. You take this view, you're gonna reap the consequence of that view as well. So you see this a lot in a lot of the tragedies. Again, very common statement here of what you see, but just, do you think that the gods are not gods and do not look after justice? Another big theme in this one is just the to only have one wife, and it's interesting reading Greek literature and seeing this come up. So here are a couple of examples. The first one here, the chorus is speaking, and they say this: "I shall never speak in praise of men who have both a wife and a mistress, nor brothers born from rival mothers. The result is strife in the home and grief which springs from enmity. May my husband be content with a single union and share his marriage bed with no others." So that's the first instance there, and then the second one a few pages later, where it says this: "That is a bad thing you speak of, when one man has two bedfellows," and that's Orestes speaking in that case. The other thing that another theme here was that this tragedy ties very closely to the Iliad. I mean, so much of the story is you have to know the Iliad to really appreciate this one well. But then there are just Euripides just floods this tragedy with references to the Iliad, and they're beautiful references. And so I want to highlight two of them, but just know that there are a number of them in this tragedy. And the more you know the Iliad, the more that you'll appreciate this particular one. But here is the first one, and I actually read this earlier. But it's when Peleus is speaking to Menelaus, and he says this: "No, you destroyed many souls of good men." And if you recall in the Iliad, the very first part of the Iliad is where and many souls went down to Hades, and so there's a direct reference there. And so Peleus is saying that very first line of the Iliad right back to Menelaus. Just a very powerful statement there. And then the way Orestes is killed is that he's killed at the altar. He should not be killed at the altar. He's killed at the Oracle of Delphi. So this is Apollo's altar, and they kill him there. So that means he's at the altar. He does not have any weapons on him. He does not have any protection, any shields or that kind of thing. And that's where he's killed. And a number of the townspeople in Delphi kill him. And then it says, "There was no one who did not stab him with his sword or strike him with a stone, pounding and smashing him." And so this idea of stabbing with a sword and being stabbed multiple times, if you recall in the Iliad, that's what happens to Hector. Hector, when Achilles kills him, the men of Greece kind of swarm around the body, and they're just amazed to see Hector here and to see him dead and see him lying on the ground. And it just says they all go up to him and just stick their sword in him and stab him. And so here you have a connection with the Iliad in that part. For Euripides, he wrote over 90 plays. This is one of 19 that survive that we still have. Historically, it was written in 425 BC. So that is around the start of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. And then, and it's somewhat in the middle of Euripides' writing career, which started in 438 BC and then went to 405. So this is somewhere in the middle of his writing life when he wrote this. I want to read one part from the intro where it says that it just talks about where and how this play might have been performed. And I thought this was really interesting. So here we go. According to an ancient piece of testimony, Andromache was not originally performed in Athens. Scholars have suggested various venues, including Argos and Thessaly, but the most probable answer is that the play was written for the royal house of the northern kingdom of Molossia, and thus may represent a unique example of an important subgenre of ancient tragedies commissioned by patrons outside of Athens. So, end quote there. And that intro is by Edith Hall. And what's interesting there is I mentioned before that the name of the son of Neoptolemus and Andromache is not mentioned in this play, but the name we found out in other mythology is Molossus. And so first, what we see here is that this play may not have been performed in Athens. It may have been performed in Argos or Thessaly instead. But then it was written for the royal house of the northern kingdom of Molossia. And again, their child was named Molossus. And so there's a connection there with this kingdom, with this child. And so perhaps this tragedy play was a way of telling the origin of this this land. And then again, when I mentioned that Peleus is so distraught that his family line has just been wiped out. Well, this may give this hope that the family line has continued through Neoptolemus and Andromache's son. So that another neat kind of part of this tragedy play. The version I read was the Oxford World's Classic version, and it's translated by James Morwood. And this particular book, it contains Hecate, the Trojan Women, and Andromache, those three plays, and they pair well together. I've covered the other two on different podcast episodes, but yeah, these all are about women and the suffering that goes along with being a woman at this time, but also being a woman on the losing side of a war. What happens after that? As for my one thing for this tragedy play, the thing that stuck out and the thing I liked the most is just how much the Iliad permeated this tragedy play. So you had the direct connections, you had the direct quotations, you had all of that, but then you also, this story doesn't happen unless you have the Iliad, and it just takes so many different people in the Iliad and gives you insight into their later life. And there's this statement that always shows up in Greek tragedy, and it shows up here in this one as well. And it actually shows up in Herodotus. That's where I first came across it, but it shows up quite early in this one. And it says this is Andromache speaking, no mortal should be called happy before he has died, and you see how he passes his final day and goes below. End quote. So there's this idea that you can't call somebody happy until you see how they have ended their life, till you see how they die, till you see the end of their life. And that's one thing that makes this tragedy play so interesting, is that you're hearing about people that you read about in the Iliad, but you're seeing them more towards the end of their life. So what have they become? What virtues or lack of virtues that you saw from them in the Iliad, how have those played out? How have they become who they have become? And I just think that's fascinating, because the Iliad ends, and then you've got the Odyssey, and you see some of these people in there. You see some of these people in some of the Greek tragedies, but what happened? Here's a case where we see what happens with Orestes later on, after he has killed his mother and is plagued by the Furies and all that. So what happens after that? And what we don't actually see in this play, but what does happen in later mythology, is that Hermione and Orestes do end up getting married, and then they give birth, or she gives birth to a son, an heir named Tisamenus. And so it continues on, and then I'm sure there's stories that are from that. But yeah, I love how all this is connected. I love this overarching Greek mythology that just permeates all of these different tragedy plays, and they are so fun to read. So I do hope you get to read this one. I hope you read some of the other Euripides plays. I have now read either 9 or 10 of them, and again, there are 19 surviving. So I have a few remaining. I can't wait to read those. I almost want to leave just one that I haven't read, just like there's this longing for one more tragedy play that I haven't read, and but I'll probably get into that in 2025, as I'm going to close out this year with reading Hellenica by Xenophon. So I just finished Thucydides earlier this week, kind of put this tragedy play Andromache in between, just to get out of the history mindset for a little bit, and then tomorrow morning I'll start back up with some history in Hellenica. Well, thank you for listening. That will do it for this episode. I want to let you know that I'm on Substack, so if you get value out of this podcast, I would love if you could return that value. I've got an option for $5 a month, $99 per year, or $500 per year. Had a couple new people on the paid subscription side of that this week who gave, and so thank you. There are now 17 people who who give to this podcast, and I don't have like tiers of levels where you get more if you give. It's just a way for you to return any value that you get out of these podcast episodes. So I appreciate that so much for those of you who have, and it just kind of helps me cover costs associated with this podcast. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you. Please, if you have something to say about Andromache, about Euripides, about this play, put it in the comments on Substack for this podcast episode. That will allow other people to read your comments. It'll allow people to comment on that, and we can kind of have a nice discussion there about this tragedy play. So one of the reasons I started this reading project, I wanted to connect to other people who were reading the same book. So if you would like to contact me directly about anything, please email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter @BooksOfTitans. And I also have the Substack, but then also a website, which is at books.booksoftitans.com. I have all my reading lists all the way back to 2017. I have my proposed great books reading list on that website, and just a number of other resources and tools to help you find other books to read and create a reading list and do all sorts of other fun stuff. Well, I'll be back next week with another book from the year's reading list. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.